if you look at like the IRA, for example, right, which is probably one of the most transformative pieces of climate legislation in the US, it does not fundamentally change how this whole model works. It just changes the economics a little bit, right? It introduces a tax incentive, but that tax incentive has now led to like the largest expansion in clean energy investment in the US ever. It's a fucking change in tax rules.
Let's rock and roll. Welcome, Dimitry. We're here at Green Planet, Blue Planet podcast, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you about enduring planet and your work in the world.
Amazing. Thanks so much for having me, Julian.
Yeah, I'm stoked. You're on a mission to finance, climate entrepreneurs and founder friendly, simple, fast, all the things that I think every entrepreneur and founder is dreaming of. So you wanna take us back to the day when that was an idea in your mind and you were like, man, this doesn't exist, and I think I have a shot at putting it together. Can you walk us through those first kind of ideation moments when you were just like, that's it, let's go?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think we have a very typical startup journey. This wasn't like, two founders in a garage, like iterating on products. That didn't happen here. So I've been working in climate and the intersection of climate and finance now for close to a decade, and climate for 15 years. I've been keenly aware of the financing gaps in this industry for a very long time. And really what precipitated us starting Enduring Planet is actually an invitation from a group called Enduring Ventures to start really any company out of the venture studio that they have. And I had already been working with the team for about a year, and when this sort of opportunity arose, I had like a month to figure out what I wanted to spend my time building. And I knew that I wanted it to be in climate finance because I think that it's a really incredible large scale problem that we need to address. And so for me, the question was, okay, if I want to build a venture backable business in climate finance where I'm actually directly impacting the flow of capital into the space, what does it need to look like? And the answer to that, there's like only so many options that you can have. And so Enduring Planet was sort of a logical conclusion from that point on.
Yeah, right on. So you focus on, companies that have existing revenue and kind of show that they can build what they're building. Tell us a bit more. Yeah.
Yeah. So we actually have two products that we invest through today. So our probably our primary one is actually what we like to call a climate grant advance, where we are helping companies who are winners of state and federal grant funds actually execute on those projects. Because oftentimes grant funding from the government is trailing. It's either on a milestone or on a reimbursement basis, which means you as the winner, you actually have to have it cash up front. You have to put it to work, and then you have to wait for the government to pay you back. And that's like a really incredibly painful liquidity challenge for a lot of companies.
Totally.
And so we address that by basically factoring those receivables, i.e., we give you money today, you pay us when the government pays you. The other product that we have is revenue-based financing, and that one is focused on businesses with existing, consistent, predictable revenue. That's often software, services, hybrid models where there might be like a hardware or a service sale component tied with a recurring revenue business. But we are also now starting to think about our third product in the market, which will likely target an even more distinct set of climate entrepreneurs. And eventually, we want to have products that serve every climate entrepreneur from inception to IPO. And we sort of want to be their source of non-dilutive funding going forward.
Mm. Yeah, you said eventually, maybe take us out, like, thinking a decade, not days. What, a decade out from today. Where's Dimitry? How is the work you're doing like landed in the world? Because I think this is the exciting part about that purpose. Now is like you really want to see the healthy planet being built around you.
I mean, in our mind, like we think about our trajectory in terms of the quantum of capital that we can put to work and the quantum of capital that we can put in the hands of climate entrepreneurs. And I think if we, if we deploy, call it $1 billion over the next 5 years, I'll be pretty happy. I think that's a really reasonable sum of money to put to work in this space, given that, you know, overall the expectation is about um, $1 trillion worth of credit need in the market every year. And so like us doing 0.1% of that seems pretty doable.
Mm. And in different measures, like if we don't measure it just in capital, like success stories, what is it that like keeps you awake at night? Where you're like, man, we made this possible. This is just beyond the wildest dream.
You know, it's interesting that you asked that question. I actually oftentimes struggle with how investors attribute impact to their dollars. Most of the businesses we fund raise capital from a wide array of investors, not just us. And so it's hard to say, oh, like we enabled this to happen, right? Because it's not just us. It's actually the entrepreneur doing the work. They get all the credit. We're just like fuel in an engine that drives somewhere. I mean, I think, to your point though, like what is that $1 billion going to accomplish? Right? Like what is it actually going to do? And I think in our case, what we think about is like, okay, that's, I don't know, 1,000, 5,000 companies that we support to address their goals. And those companies are doing everything from, today our portfolio has just 20 companies. They're doing everything from frontier R&D for solid state heat pumps to deploying solar all along the eastern seaboard, right? Like we have a very broad thesis within climate. We support anything that drives abatement of emissions, carbon removal, adaptation and resilience work. And oftentimes the impact metrics across those businesses are dramatically different. Like we have work in the water space, we have work in the energy space, we have work in the waste space. It's all in scope for us. And so like we generally try to not abstract too far away from like how much capital have we put to work, because that's a very explicit measure of our impact, because all we do is climate finance. That's like we don't invest outside of this industry, and so by design every dollar we put to work is having an impact on the crisis.
Right. I mean, this is kind of where I think the measurement of it beyond finance becomes so important. Is like climate impact are super fancy buzzwords, but at the same time, it's like, the real experience on the ground and like what reality it's actually creating, I think is so important, right? Like our own connection to nature and life in that, and our own maybe like joy or love for nature and life, I think are like the driving factors. Now, like how do you see that yourself? Like how, from a numeric perspective and a logic perspective, like yeah, those are really amazing, steep goals, but also just as you said, they're maybe even reasonable goals for the next decade, right? How is that love for nature? Like how do you connect with that in your everyday work? Because I'm just curious about understanding that, as in like what drives you.
Yeah. Oh man, good question. I mean, look, I think part of what allows us to sort of approach this problem with the perspective that we have is how we design this business and how climate is central to the very existence of Enduring Planet. So like as a corporation, so we're a public benefit corporation in the state of Delaware. We have a dual mission, and part of that is to support climate entrepreneurs with capital, and the other is to specifically focus on supporting underrepresented founders, diverse teams, and companies serving marginalized communities. So we have this like dual impact thesis. There's a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice lens, and there's a climate lens. And I think that I've worked in the space long enough now to, for me, like the connection to the problem, I don't need to feel it every day. I don't need to go and visit one of our borrowers and like see the work that they're doing to feel connected to climate, because like that's all our business does. And I think that, and maybe this is where like I'm getting tripped up with this question, is that I don't know if it's important for us to be good at what we do to feel this like additional connection to nature. Like our job is to put money to work in the hands of climate entrepreneurs and to not discriminate based on quantum of climate impact on the space where they're having an impact. Like, to me, a company that is supporting the deployment of better, cleaner grid infrastructure via software, which has very indirect impacts in the space that are like almost impossible to measure, supporting them is just as important as someone who's going out and planting trees and having a very explicit impact. Like, to us, those are the same. Now, other investors in the climate space, they might view this problem differently and might say, okay, well, we need to see a gigaton of emission reduction in order for us to invest, right? They have these like big, lofty decarbonization goals. I think that's laudable. I also think that that creates really weird problems in terms of who they actually fund, because oftentimes these are very long-term bets with a lot of uncertainty around the timing and the actual magnitude of emission reduction. And depending on what assumptions you actually put into your model, like, they might have that gigaton emission reduction impact, or they might not. And it's really just up to you as an investor to say, like, how do I feel today about the inputs in this spreadsheet? And like, what is that going to do for my LPs? Right. And like, we don't make those distinctions. For us, it's all the same.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think I'm gonna double tap there just out of curiosity again. I think,
yeah.
Let's go back to like the Albert Einstein quote of like, you can't solve a problem at the level of consciousness in which it was created, right? And so when we look at the state of the world, I think a lot of the challenges to pollution, climate, sustainability, all of these buzzwords that most people just read about in the news, they're so removed from the way a lot of people actually live. Now, not for everyone. There's also people that live just right smack dab in the middle of it, right? Especially when we talk about pollution. But I think the fundamental level of consciousness these were created in is just kind of this separation from nature, the separation as if this is like an external, point of value equation, rather than this intrinsic connection to say, well, fuck, we're connected to nature because we are nature, and we're in love with nature. And if we were to create a different world from that level of perception, from that level of consciousness, what becomes possible? And then business metrics kind of are just the vehicle to get there, right?
Look, I think your point is well taken, and there's actually one of my favorite quotes comes from a book called Ishmael. I don't know if you've ever read it, where there's this concept of being a part of nature versus a part from nature. But again, coming back to like the work that we do, at the very core of our thesis is that we need to exist in a new climate economy where every business is a climate business. And so for us, like, look, man, I've spent 15 years working on this problem. For a decade, I worked in emerging markets with, sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, with very marginalized populations who are probably the most impacted by climate change. And I saw this work like very much firsthand. And I think there are cases where that kind of engagement is required. But I also think that in our context, like, the thing that matters is that we put money in the hands of entrepreneurs as quickly as possible so that they can do the work that they understand to be important for this new climate economy. And so for us, like, we built this business because of our connection to this problem. Like, we're not like fucking YC founders who like showed up and like said, oh man, climate is hot because I read about it in Forbes, I'm going to build this business, right? Like, those people, yeah, they probably need to spend a little bit more time and like get in touch with the problem. Like, I know what the problem is. And maybe this is hubris. Like, maybe this is me being, the like privileged white guy tech bro being like, oh, I don't like need to think about that to solve it. I mean, I think for me, like, that's all we did. That's what I did for 15 years. Let's think about this problem. I feel like I can't tell if I'm like getting it, or if I am, if maybe we just, like, for me, I think the other question here that we're sort of talking about is like, can you, and maybe this is where you're getting at, is like, can we even solve this problem with capitalism when it was created by capitalism? And that's like a very different discussion. right? Like in a perfect
Yeah, that's
world,
like the next
if I
level of that same
yeah,
trajectory. Yeah.
yeah, if like in a perfect world, if I could like wave a magic wand and solve climate change, it would not be by building enduring planet.
Hmm. Tell us how. What would it be? Like
We
let's
would
wave the magic wand. Just got
we
really interesting.
we
Yeah.
would dismantle capitalism. I mean, like the incentive structures around extractive consumption are fundamentally misaligned with climate change. Now, the problem is like you can't do that on the kind of time scale that we need to act, right? Like capitalism has become this entrenched system that has total control over our entire existence. I mean, fuck, we're like doing a podcast right now, right? Like, why are we doing a podcast? Because it like it drives outcomes that matter to people. And there's like, I think in the, if we could have this, like, there's this really beautiful book I just read, which falls into this like genre of solar punk. I don't know if you've ever heard this term, but it like
What's the name of the
imagines a
book?
future where, oh man, I'm gonna botch it right now. So I'm gonna look it up.
Look it up. It's
I'm terrible.
imagining a future.
My memory is just the worst. It's a series called I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. Yeah, so it's a series by an author called Becky Chambers, and there's two books. And it's called the Monk and Robot series. And the first one is a psalm for the wild built, and the second book is called a prayer for the crown shy. And it imagines this world in which effectively like machines and artificial intelligence become sentient and then says, you know what, like we're not like angry, or we're not going to like destroy civilization because you put us in this like enslaved state. We're just going to leave, and we're going to live on our own, and you guys live on your own, and like we're just not going to interact. And what this creates is it forces humanity to say, well, shit, we no longer have all of these tools that we depended on, that we were like kind of destroying the planet with, and like maybe we should re-envision how we exist. And it kind of becomes this like utopia of existing with nature, right? And
Interesting how it got there. Yeah.
yeah, I
Well,
mean, it like required this like shock to the system. um I don't know, I maybe we're getting off topic here, but
no, I love
I
it.
think
I
about
think we
this
just
kind of
got
stuff a
so on
lot.
topic. I totally love, what you're doing with Enduring Planet. And that's why we're having you on. And this idea of like entrepreneurs and people that drive change are central to the transformation, including of, as you said, including of the transformation of capitalism itself. Like in my like magic world, waving a wand, I think it's not so much dismantling it as like evolving it, like brutally pointing out the shortcomings, like as you said, of continuous extractive behavior and creating incentives that might be, more aligned with the standards we actually want to live by, right? So the book you just shared, based on the reflection from sentient intelligence, it's like, and I don't even know if that's fully possible, but like let's just go with the premise of the book, and it's like, hey guys, you're kind of boring, and we want to walk away. Now that is an interesting mirror for us as humans, now to realize, man, maybe we messed up, and not even based on all of the direct outcomes, or again, I prefer the word pollution, but because of the way we go about it in the first place. And I think that way of how we go about it is kind of why I asked you this question, like, where's your love for nature anchored in? Like, what's that experience? Is it the way you grew up? Is it the way you, I don't know, live close to a forest in Oregon? Or like, somewhere there, I think
Yeah,
our love for nature is the drive for actually and desiring to create a healthy planet, right? Like I often say, I was born in the
I
late 80s, that we were inheriting this like messy fucking infrastructure and this messy political and economic system. And it seems almost impossible to solve how to create a healthy version out of it. But maybe it's possible.
I think maybe this is also where we diverge, is that I'm not doing the work that I'm doing for love of planet. Like I actually, this is a conclusion that I came to. So I did the Peace Corps in Latin America, and I was working in the foothills of this mountain called Salake in Honduras. And I kind of had this realization that like one and and I'm a classically trained ecologist, so there's some context here, right? Like my goal initially when I joined the Peace Corps was like, how do I restore damaged ecosystems? How do I bring the planet back to this like healthy, happy place? And the more that I interacted with people who are actually existing in the ecosystems, the more I started to realize that like it's not really about the ecosystem. Like the planet, whether we totally like we could fucking nuke this place into total desert tomorrow, and in I don't know 10, 100 million years, the planet will be fine. Ecosystems will get restored. I mean, there's been cataclysmic events of similar scales before. Well, hold
Totally.
on. Let me finish.
Yeah.
Hold on, let
Yeah.
me finish. So for me, like the motivation is not restoring the planet. The motivation for me is ensuring that people can exist and that they can exist in a way that is equitable and fair and just. And part of the problem with the systems that we've created is that we all get to like have this conversation on our fancy phones with our fancy headsets while much of the world suffers as a result. And part of our vision for the new climate economy is that we can exist in a universe where folks can have access to basic services, where they can have their needs met, where they can live a life that's comparable to ours without like planetary collapse, right? Because the way that we're tracking right now, climate change is going to disproportionately impact those populations. Like you and I, we might not even particularly care that it's like a few degrees warmer. But if you grow coffee in Latin America, or if you're trying to, I don't know, produce any crop in sub-Saharan Africa, right now it's pretty fucking dire. And to me, that's what motivates me. It's not a love of nature; it's a love of people.
That are part of nature, right? Because people are intrinsically connected to nature. But I love your passion, man. This is one of those driving forces is passion and this fire, right? And this like this burning energy that's like, man, like this is what I care for, and what I care for, therefore,
Yeah,
it makes me go out and sometimes in our modern world that's too politically correct, we forget about that. It's like no, that's the good stuff. That's the good stuff,
totally.
and yeah, I mean, it's so ultimately you're saying your love for nature, aka people, is what drives you, right? That's why I'm asking, because it's like that we as people understanding ourselves intrinsically connected to the world we're building, I think, is a big, maybe not entirely that next level of consciousness that Einstein quote refers to, but a stepping stone to it, right? And then when we look back and we reflect and we're like, man, these systems we have inherited them, right? No one asked you when you were a child if you like those systems and if you want to opt in. It's just the way it is, right? And you're right, like it's maybe easier for someone growing up in Germany like me, or for someone growing up in the States, or for someone growing up, in Canada to find your way with that than it would be for someone growing up in Latin America or Africa, or somewhere in Southeast Asia. But at the end of the that kind of argument, I think all of us desire a world that is more just, as you said, that has more equity, or more access points for people, and I really believe it comes through the transformation of entrepreneurs just like yourself, right? Which is kind of where this is full circle to, like, that passion
Yeah,
is exactly creating a next step. 200 years from now, will people look back at us and say, these guys were just, making a baby step? Maybe, but hopefully that baby step takes us somewhere, right?
yeah. I mean, I think
Yeah.
this
No,
is
go ahead. Yeah.
no. Please go
I
ahead.
wanted to ask a question, a follow-up question here, which
Yeah,
is like,
go.
what do you think does it take for humanity to learn from its past mistakes?
Whoa. I think the last few millennia have shown that we don't. And and frankly, I'm not so like I think I often have more confidence in figuring out ways to like convince terrible systems to seek out self-preservation in a way that like changes the trajectory of the planet than I do in like dismantling said systems, right? Like I think if you look at a lot of the and maybe this is a question of sort of timeline too, right? Like when we talk about climate change, I think what a lot of people don't understand is that even though this is a problem for the next 200 years, we have a very short window in which we can actually make a difference that will matter before like certain outcomes are almost guaranteed. And we don't want those outcomes. Like if we don't make dramatic changes to how we exist in the world over the next 2 decades, there's going to be a lot of suffering, regardless of how much decarbonization or removal or whatever we do in 2050, in 2100. Like by that point, there's going to be a lot of pain. And so then the question is like, okay, if we're going to try to make a difference on a timeline that matters, what is a reasonable thing that we could try to pursue? And unfortunately, there's some learning from our mistakes in the sense of like, oh, maybe we should not use fossil fuels. But if you look at how it's actually playing out in real time, it's not because like Shell or Exxon is deciding that, oh shit, this is bad for the planet, I'm going to stop. It's because we are creating financial incentives where people are like, oh man, I can make way more money betting on a clean energy future, so I'm going to go do that. Which is like why the IRA is so impactful. And this is sort of like why I'm like, man, if I could wave a magic wand, I would just shut them all the fuck down. I'd be like, hey, you know what? As of today, Exxon does not exist. As of today, Shell does not exist.
Let's just figure out a way around it. Yeah.
Let's just.
I think a lot of us think this way, right? But then we come back to like this does kind of look and feel like the magic wand scenario. So it's like, man, what are the workarounds, right? Like, what is a currency or like a currency system that would support a whole different way of economics? And the incentives are actually based on the love of people, the love of nature, the love of the environment we live in, and the way we can trade with each other. And it's not here yet, but I sure know there's tons of people that think this way, that put their brain cells to work on it. So I wouldn't be surprised if we in the next 10, 20 years find a way to get there. But I also don't fully know. I just feel like it has to happen,
It's kind of like fusion. If you ever talk to folks who have worked in fusion for a long time, commercial fusion is always 10 or 20 years away. And like now it feels closer than ever. And in some ways it's really exciting because now, like Microsoft just bought a bunch of future electricity from a fusion energy provider starting in 2026 or whatever. And like, cool. Okay. That's exciting. But, I'll believe it when I see it. And I think I have the same reaction for a lot of these efforts where they're like, oh, we're going to replace monetary systems, or we're going to replace currencies, or we're going to replace how business is transacted. And it's like, like a lot of folks have promised that. And part of the problem is that the systems that you're trying to disrupt have way more power than like whatever innovative idea you might have. And unfortunately, in the time span where you are trying to disrupt them in a way that like probably won't lead to an outcome, there's a big opportunity cost for the people who are actually being impacted today. And so, I mean, look, I think there's a lot of folks in this industry who fundamentally disagree with me, but like, and that's okay. I think one of the beautiful things about climate action is that it requires everyone to take a shot at whatever thing they think will have the biggest impact. Like, if we all do that, we're going to be okay.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting bet to have, right? Like, because you could support 1,000 projects, but if one of them doesn't just pivot our direction by one degree, but like reinvents the fundamental game, like that's exactly how it happens. I threw this Albert Einstein quote at you earlier. There's a Buckminster Fuller quote that I like even better. That's, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. You change something by building a new model that makes the old model or existing models obsolete, right? And that's pretty much exactly what you're hedging on when you say you're supporting the transformation of entrepreneurs, right? Which I think is a very exciting pursuit. You're waving your hand. Like what comes up for you?
I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know. I would say that a lot of the work that we're supporting is very much like incremental change that is participating within the system, right? Like if you look at, um, the deployment of clean energy in the U.S., like it has occurred as a result of people using the same system to to change how energy is created, but it's not like the fundamentals of capitalism or electricity generation have been disrupted. It's marginal impact, but it's marginal impact with consistent continued investment. And if you look at like the IRA, for example, right, which is probably one of the most transformative pieces of climate legislation in the US, it does not fundamentally change how this whole model works. It just changes the economics a little bit, right? It introduces a tax incentive, but that tax incentive has now led to like the largest expansion in clean energy investment in the US ever. It's a fucking change in tax rules. Like the government didn't go out and say, hey, we're just going to shut all this shit down that's destroying the planet. They said, hey, we're going to make it marginally better for the shit that's going to save the planet to exist. And that is having a bigger impact on the decarbonization of this country than possibly any activity undertaken in the last 2 decades, other than like, some fundamental R&D around storage, maybe. Like that, like it is just truly transformative. And it is in the grand scheme of things, it is this like very marginal tweak. And you're seeing the same thing all around the world where because we have decided that capitalism is going to stick around, and because we have collectively decided that we're not going to dismantle this system that fucked us in the first place, like the pathways for change then look like this. They look like these marginal tweaks. And like that might still be okay. Like I think that there is a pathway for us to be successful and to survive given these types of approaches, because in the end, like this behemoth that we have built that is self-perpetuating and self-preserving, it cares only about one thing, which is like generating more value, generating more wealth. And so then the question is like, okay, can we better quantify the value and wealth created from the transition and better quantify the loss of value and the loss of wealth by sticking to the old paradigm? And then the system will steer itself towards like a better climate future. And I think that's the only bet we have, because at this point, like we have, I don't know, we have a decade.
I'm gonna want to ask a question just about you, Dimitri. I
Do it.
believe that business and entrepreneurship are clearly a vehicle for transformation and change. And I love that. I think this is one of the positive ways about how our systems are, around us. But I also think that every business can only grow as much as the founder, the CEO, the person that's kind of leading it, right? How do
Sure.
you personally address it in your life? Like, how do you lean into personal growth and just the expansion of your own mindset, your own worldview? But like, what do you let in to rock your boat a little?
I think the vast majority of my growth over the last 5 years has been through being a parent. And so I don't think I truly understood the the forcing function of like raising a child, and also like being a parent with another person. Like I learn an incredible amount from my partner, and oftentimes the the growth comes from like the friction of trying to instill good values in your kid, of trying to explain the world to them, like of trying to navigate really complicated issues, when it comes to just like supporting their existence, right? And kids these days, I think, are much less sheltered from the reality of the world. At least my kid is, and what that means is that like, when she was 3, we were having discussions around police violence and sort of racial inequality in the U.S., and it shaped my perspective. And now we have conversations about um, income inequality and homelessness and climate change. And every time these conversations happen, you know, oftentimes I get asked questions by my kid where I realize that like my perspective or my the idea that I had in my head is informed by all of this like baggage. And as soon as you take the baggage away, you realize like, man, I don't actually have like a justifiable reason for believing what I believe. And those are also like always very like world shaking moments, you know? Like my kid and I right now spend a lot of time talking about vegetarianism. So my 5-year-old has decided that she's a vegetarian. And And we talk about it pretty regularly because she always asks questions about sort of like the animal products I eat and the meat that I eat and like where certain stuff comes from. And the more we have these conversations, the more I realize that like I don't actually have a good argument for like why I choose to allow entire species to suffer immeasurably so that like I can eat something. And I haven't stopped eating meat. I eat a lot less meat now than I ever did before, partially because both my wife and my kid are vegetarian. But there was also a time when I remember having these arguments with my wife and talking about like trying to quantify like how much enjoyment I get out of eating something versus like the suffering that that animal endures so that I could eat it. And like now I'm like all of this is just like mental acrobatics to get around the fact that I don't have a good answer. And we have these conversations a lot. And so I mean I think part of the other challenge too is that like between building this business and raising my kid, I don't really have time for anything else. And so like I don't have time to like listen to podcasts or read books or like I think I've read half the books in the last year that I had read on probably a monthly basis before having a kid and running a business. And it sucks, but I get this incredible like because she is learning and curious and absorbing the world, I get to learn with her, and that's been really incredible.
Mm. That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that side of you. I have a follow up question because it's going to be relevant for you if she's 5 right now. If you could single handedly, or with your team of experts, change the education system that we know, what would you do?
Oh man, that's a better question for my mom. She's an education professor actually, and this is like all she does is,
Okay, cool.
um, you know, I think that the things that I've seen be really impactful for my kid is like really deep experiential learning, right? So learning that gives her the opportunity to really engage with a problem. It's either tactical or visual or whatever, where it's like very much participatory. And I think oftentimes um, this is the form of learning in very early childhood education, right? Like there's a lot of play, a lot of exploration, and then over time, those elements of learning get sort of like taken out of the education system, and it becomes this like repetitive, like kind of almost mindless like absorption of information without digestion. And I think if you look at the really successful models of education, and I'm not an education expert, so like I'm not trying to like promote anything, but I think if you do look at a lot of the things that do work really well, there's often this like deep experiential component where people get to explore an idea rather than just get told an idea. And we're very fortunate that we have the resources to put our kid in like a really good preschool where she can have these types of experiences. And we're also very lucky that the kindergarten she's going to attend next year, which is public, so she's going to go to public school in our neighborhood. Like it's a STEAM school. They have a bunch of grant money. They're like very focused on experiential learning, and so at least for the next like 5 years, she should continue to get that. Um, but yeah, I mean, like I've now been part of two education systems. I grew up in Russia till I was 10, and then I moved to the States, and they're very different, and they're both very flawed. And like, yeah, it's hard, man. That's a big problem. That's a whole other problem.
It's a whole other problem. That's why I love asking this question, and it's even better when people turn parents. Um, I have a question about optimism as a choice, because you have a 5-year-old at this point as we're recording this, and so
Yeah.
enduring planet is already in the title. It's all about like it continuing to exist in a healthy way. So how do you choose optimism? Like how does that process look for you? Because we've heard your passion. There's clearly a lot of fire going on. So like when you feel like it's all running against the wall, what do you do? How do you choose that? How do you come back to optimism?
Yeah. So I had this moment in grad school. It was probably this like second week of grad school that has forever burned itself into my brain. And I like always come back to this experience. So we were I don't know if you've ever spent much time in the Bay Area, but there's a bunch of these really incredible um, beaches along the coast of California that run up from San Francisco all the way to the north. And um, there's a park called Point Reyes, which is this really incredible landscape. It's actually a really cool story because Point Reyes used to be attached to LA, and it slowly migrates on tectonic plates up the coast of California. And it's got like a really cool ecosystem. And so we were out there with this professor from Berkeley, John Hart, and John is like one of the fathers of like modern ecology, like one of the most fundamental people to sort of climate change science, ecological science, like just awesome. And I think now he's retired. So this was like a couple of years before he retired, and we were out hiking on this beach, and one of the students, a friend of mine, was like, "Hey, if you could summarize the state of the world to lay people in as simple terms as you could, like how would you communicate the gravity of the situation to people?" And John looked at all of us and he said, "We're fucked." And all of us are sitting there and we're like, "What are we supposed to do with that?" Right? And so the follow-on question was, okay, well, if we're truly fucked, then like, why are we all here? Like, why are we doing this? And he said, you know, if you agree that we're fucked, there's only two logical conclusions. The first is that you like crawl into a hole and you just accept defeat and you accept that we're fucked and you live in like, basically depression for the rest of your life in this like dark hole somewhere. That's one outcome. And the other is that you fight like hell to try to change the trajectory of how fucked we are. And that requires a belief that you can change it and that it requires this optimism. And those are the only two things. There's nothing else if you truly accept where we are today. And that stuck with me because I know so much about this problem now where I'm like, man, we really did it. We did it. We knew 30 years ago that we should stop, 40 years ago that we should stop, 50 years ago we should stop, and we didn't. And we kept fucking ourselves. And so now the question is, okay, well, what do we do? Do you accept defeat or do you try to change it? And that's what gives me optimism is like, if I don't have the optimism, the alternative is like really dark. And I don't want that. I don't need that in my life.
Yeah, that's a fundamental choice, right? I mean, you made this really horrible, but also horribly clear example earlier about like, we could, throw a nuclear bomb at the planet and make it a desert, but only because we can. Should we? Right? And that's ultimately a choice. There might be people, and there might have been people in their 40s that were like, no, let's just do it. It's a great technology. And so I think this is very similar to where we're at right now. It's like there's a whole generation, and that's our generation and younger as well, that there's like, no, but like what's really worth living for, right? And so that is rising in our consciousness gives me tremendous hope. And so before we wrap today, I have one more question, and that's, I want to know, Dimitry, like your dream for those future generations. Like what are you putting into place right now, with the way you're being, with the way you're thinking, the way you're feeling, the way you're loving people. You mentioned that earlier. That is like a, not in a religious sense, but almost like a prayer, like a call for a positive future.
I mean, I believe that a society can exist where we don't depend on exploitation for happiness. And I think that one day I hope that we collectively decide that like someone's smartphone isn't worth kids mining in Africa and dying. Like it still shocks me today that we think it's okay in the US to still have slaves, because we still do that. Like slavery is allowed in context of incarceration. That's surreal to me. Um, I think that like I hope one day we live in a society where we actually think through the externalities of our work, and we like take them into account when making decisions, right? Because today that's not what we do. We're like, oh yeah, I'm going to drive this car, and I'm not going to like, I don't know. That's not a really good example because I think it puts the onus on individuals. But like maybe as a government, hey, we're going to be okay with us as a society emitting and destroying the planet for our like temporary enjoyment. And I don't think it has to be that way. Like I don't think we need to live that way.
Yeah, beautifully said. The 7 generational perspective is like fundamental to so many, original people on this planet and indigenous people of this planet, and it somehow has gotten lost in our modern pursuit of momentary happiness. Dimitry, thank you so much for your time, for your work with Enduring Planet, and just putting all that passion to work. This is really, really
Thanks,
fun
Julian.
to see.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.